Jesus wept. This is the shortest verse in the entire Bible, but how powerful these two words are. Just two words. Jesus wept. It happened long ago in the village of Bethany. Jesus was coming to mourn the death of his good friend Lazarus. Lazarus had two sisters, Mary and Martha, and when Jesus saw their grief, he was overcome with emotion. The gospel tells us when Jesus saw them weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He asked where the dead body of their brother was. They said, "Lord, come and see." What happened next was simply this: Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Isn't this surprising to hear that Jesus cried? Many of us were brought up to think that crying was a sign of weakness, perhaps even an indication of emotional problems. We were taught from an early age that we are not supposed to cry. Big boys don't cry, big girls don't cry. How many times have you cried and then apologized for it? Well, Jesus lived the one perfect human life, and Jesus wept. To be human is to be a griever for all kinds of losses. This quote comes from one of my seminary professors, Dr. Herbert Anderson, who has written a book entitled "All Our Losses, All Our Griefs." One of his main points is summed up in his statement: to be human is to be a griever for all kinds of losses. Now, of course, we naturally and most often associate grief with death. I suppose death does cause the most painful kind of grief, but there's other sources of grief as well. What causes grief? Well, loss. Any kind of loss. Life, of course, is full of losses. Losses cannot be avoided. We grow up and lose our childhood. We move away from home and leave our family behind. We get a new job, perhaps move to a different area, leaving friends behind. Life is full of losses, and loss creates grief. Loss, and therefore grief, is an inescapable part of life. Grief is normal. It's important for us to realize that grief is one of the many emotions that we are experiencing in these days. We are grieving the loss of our temporary way of life. We're also grieving not being able to be with our loved ones. Sometimes we Christians feel guilty when we experience grief. We might think that grief indicates a lack of faith. Well, that certainly is not true. Jesus, after all, wept at the loss of his good friend Lazarus. In his book, Anderson speaks of 5 major kinds of losses. The first kind is material loss. Maybe we lose a physical object or surroundings to which we have become attached. We might lose the house that we live in, or a special gift that someone has given us, or maybe a family heirloom. The loss of material things can be a form of grief. A second kind of loss that Anderson identifies that leads to grief is the loss of a relationship. It may be a good friend who moves far away, or a special relationship that ends, or a divorce that ends a marriage, or of course the death of a loved one. These are but some of the ways in which the loss of a relationship can cause us to grieve. The third form of loss is the loss of self-image. We experience this kind of loss within ourselves. We have early on dreamed of what our life would be like. We hope to accomplish certain things, but life passes us by and Many of our dreams and our hopes fall apart. We will not be the person that we had hoped. We lose the dream. Loss of self-image can be another way that causes us to grieve. A fourth kind of loss that can lead to grief is what Anderson calls functional loss. By functional loss, he means the loss of physical functions. Loss of limb, loss of sight, loss of hearing, loss of one physical ability after another. As a person gets older, are losses that can cause us to grieve. We grieve over the loss of our abilities due to the loss of some of our physical functions. A fifth form of loss is role loss. Loss of the roles that we have played in our family or in our work is a significant form of loss. Retirement or losing a job is a form of this loss. We tend to find our identity in the work that we do, but when we are no longer working, we lose a part of our identity. Oftentimes, parents feel this way after the last child has left home. This loss can be very difficult. Grief is our response when we lose a role that we have played in life. Now, all these kinds of losses cause us to grieve. To be human is to experience losses. And when we lose something important, we grieve. Anderson gives this definition of grief. Grief is the normal but bewildering cluster of human emotions arising in response to a significant loss, intensified and complicated by the relationship to the person or object lost. And Anderson further insists that grief is a journey or a process, not a state. This is to say that grief is not an absolute state in which we are either in or out of, but rather it's like a journey with ups and downs, a gradual process of healing. Now, the journey of grief is different for everyone, and yet there are some elements of grief common to everyone. These elements are not stages that we go through. They are rather aspects that all people experience from time to time along the journey of grief. One common element of grief is the feeling of numbness, an absence of feeling. This happens especially after the death of a loved one. Sometimes people describe it as wandering lost in a fog, unaware of most everything going on around them. A second common element people experience in grief is the feeling of emptiness, loneliness, isolation. And this is why it is so important that a grieving person have often people around them. People don't necessarily have to be saying anything. Sometimes silence is all that is required. People in the midst of grief feel isolated and need to be surrounded by others. Often it is simply the presence of people and not necessarily the words that they say that has the most healing power. It's too bad in these days of separation that we cannot be with one another more than we are. Fear and anxiety is a third common element in grief. Having lost something of importance, we fear that we too will be abandoned. We are fearful about our own survival. The forces against us are powerful. We fear what might happen in the future. What will happen to us now? Will we survive? A fourth common element in grief is guilt and shame. Guilt is especially powerful. We might ask or think, why do I live when my loved one died? Or we might think, well, maybe this loss is my fault. Our shame, of course, is our embarrassment over our grieving. Christians bear more than their share of shame when they believe the myth that Christians should not grieve. And then a fifth element of grief is anger. In anger, we protest the separation and loss that we have experienced. It just doesn't seem fair to us. A grieving person often becomes angry with God, and that's okay. The book of Psalms has many verses in it expressing anger towards God, and so does the book of Job. That's okay. God can take it. We need to get the anger out of our system. Then, of course, sadness and despair is another element of grief. We feel so hurt, our heart aching, like part of our body has been ripped away. The very core of our soul aches with pain, and the sadness and despair can be overwhelming. And then a seventh and final common element in grief that I want to mention is physical. Our physical body reacts to this loss. Sometimes there's a tightness in our throat, a shortness of breath, a need for sighing, an empty feeling in our stomach, perhaps a loss of appetite, an inability to sleep. Grief does such things to our body. Grief is a very powerful human emotion. In his play King Henry VI, William Shakespeare wrote, "To weep is to make less the depth of grief." I just think that's such a marvelous line. To weep is to make less the depth of grief. Weeping is part of the healing process. It's how we make it through grief. Weeping. There's no other way. It's normal to cry. Jesus did, and so do we. Now, being a Christian does not mean that we should not grieve. What it does mean, however, is that we grieve with the assurance that God is with us and that we have the hope of eternal life. The Apostle Paul once wrote that Christians should not grieve as others who have no hope. Paul means that we are to grieve, but we are to do so with hope. What did Jesus do when he heard about the death of Lazarus? Well, he first came and he mourned with the family. We tend to quickly pass over this fact and skip ahead to Jesus raising Lazarus. Raising a dead man back to life surely is a great miracle, and yes, Jesus will one day do the same for you and me. But until that final day of resurrection, there's something very important that we are to keep in mind. Jesus is with us in our times of grief. That was true for Mary and Martha long ago, and surely it's true for you and me today. It's very important for us to realize that Jesus is not absent from us in these difficult days of us trying to deal with this coronavirus. Jesus is not above or distant from the pain and suffering in our lives. Jesus does not stay away from the suffering in the world, but amazingly he enters right into the midst of it. As Jesus long ago came to grieve with Mary and Martha, surely Jesus comes to us in these difficult days. So as we grieve and struggle with the difficulties and losses in our lives, including dealing with the coronavirus, Jesus will be with us. And if and when we cry, he will cry with us because he loves and cares for you and me so very much. For after all, just outside the village of Bethany so long ago, when he saw the grief-stricken faces of Mary and Martha, Jesus wept. Amen.